I'm coming back to this idea of poetics. What I want to try and do in this video is to talk about the poetry that connects, by which I mean the poetics of, or an attempt to forge, attempts that have been made to forge poetics that connect the poetics of the impersonal to the poetics of the personal. If you're coming across this video for the first time, I'll post this actually as a response to my previous video in which I gave a bit of background to what I'm talking about there. Okay, so what I want to try and say here, see if I can get to it, what I claim I want to try and make is that having tentatively established that there's a poetics which describes the impersonal world best understood as science, and there's a very different poetics which tries to understand the personal world, and that's encapsulated in all different kinds of processes, but psychoanalysis or something like that might be as good as any kind of identity theories. Use a poetics of the personal. What I want to try and suggest here is that the best description we have of poetics that joins those two is one that might be called religion. Religion. Now it's a really loaded term, and I'm not making any claim that the only function, or even any function of all religions, is necessarily this function of connecting the personal to the impersonal. But I'd like to speculate that it could be one of them. I think I'm taking quite a broad view of what constitutes religion in this sense. I'm certainly not talking about the organised infrastructures that religion provides. I'm talking about some of the kind of core experiences, some of the what's it sometimes called, the perennial philosophies that underpin some religions, and some of the kind of recurrent mythologies that lots of religions try to suggest. Let me just think of a couple of examples. Yeah, something like well, the idea of the human soul. Not the whole thing of the human soul, but the human soul is quite an interesting idea. But one of the features of the human soul, and there's lots of things to it, but one of the features of that as an idea, and I should say I'm not arguing that it exists, I'm just talking about it existing as a concept. One of the ideas is that the human soul is kind of like a holographic fragment of some larger entity. That's how it features a lot in the language. You know, that it's a tiny candle, or it's a spark of the great illumination of the divine, or it's you know, it has all those kinds of attributes. It's something that will upon death be combined and become part of the greater light. It has all, again, that's some of the poetry that surrounds it. And it seems to me that that's a poetic allusion to something which is a connection, a mythological connection that tells a story about the connection between two poetries. A poetry which is about something individual, located in space, viewpointed, has perspective, has particularly duration in space and time, and the connection between that and something else which is not located in space and time, which has eternity at its disposal rather than duration. You know, basically the attributes that science has, the attributes of the impersonal. You know, as I said before, the impersonal, one of the characteristics of the impersonal is that it exists without us. It has claims for eternal verities. That's the kind of impersonal claims that science makes. That it's it's not a particular time frame in which those truths exist. So in some ways, I think that little tiny story of the fragmentary soul joining the great light of the beyond is a kind of attempt to try to do that, to join the dots poetically between the poetry of the impersonal and the poetry of the personal. You also find it, I think, in phrases like the ground of all being. I mean, I've talked about that before, but again, I think that's a kind of phrase which again unites certain aspects of humanity. The fact that it's a ground. You know, let's not forget that when we're talking about the ground, we're talking about something solid and something real. And there's a whole set of circuits in our brain and schematic understandings of what ground is in our brain that's being activated when we think in those terms, even though we're not conscious of it. It comes with all that cognitive baggage. And the ground of all being from which life emerges and to which it will return is is something of that. You know, the ground existed before we came around. It'll always be there. we as humans have a particular relationship to the ground. We kind of stand on it and walk around on it. But I think I'm right in saying that even the term human has been attributed to humando, a word humando, which means to bury. You know, we are the people who bury one another when we die. Going back to the ground, there's something about that. You know, also the word Adam, I think, the biblical Adam, is a play on a word Adama, which means dirt or soil or earth. So there's something there about a kind of mythological narrative which is attempting to find a way of articulating the experience of being one of these things that walks around on the ground like we do, and the ground itself, you know, the ground which is around before we came on the scene, the ground onto which we're kind of cast and thrown and find ourselves walking around, and the ground to which we will, as humando humans, be consigned, you know, on our death. So again, I think there's a bit of a, you know, it's clearly poetry. It's mythological poetry, but it's a poetry that connects the impersonal and the personal. I'm just racking my brains for another example. I don't feel I'm being very convincing right now. Yeah, I suppose I would look outside of those things. I mean, it attempts outside of that to make those kind of connections. Something like Edward O. Wilson's book Consilience, which came out a few years ago. It's not really a religious book in any sense, but it's not a religious book, that's full stop. But its ambitions are to try to make some kinds of connections across the disciplines that talk poetically, albeit not apparently poetically, but really poetically, about the objective and impersonal worlds of science, and the other disciplines which talk about the world of what it is to be alive and awake and a human being. Personal stuff, first person, subjective, viewpoint, third person, objective, viewpointless, clarity, objectivity, eternal truths of science. You know, again, it had those kind of aspirations. And even I have to say this, but well, I think I have to find really fairly naff narratives that you find in a lot of New Age stuff. I mean, something like Ken Wilber, I don't like a lot of Ken Wilber stuff, I've got to tell you. But the aspiration of a lot of his stuff, you know, this kind of 4-quadrant model he tries to build up, is an aspiration towards mapping the poetic languages which we use to think about the objective and the subjective, the impersonal and the personal. Personally, it's not one that I connect with very happily, but I can admire his ambition. Yeah, I suppose that's all I've got to say really. So yeah, just to recap, cognitive procedures in the brain, schematic circuitry laid down which allows us to think abstract thoughts. We use some of those circuits, some of those schemas to think about impersonal ideas that science captures. We use a whole different set of schematic thoughts, again circuitry, to think about personal stuff like who am I, what am I doing here, what am I here for, what is right, what is wrong for me. A whole different set of processes, again poetic, but there may be processes that connect those two, a poetics of that connection, which I think is probably best encapsulated by something like religion. And I guess I can't help but being reminded again that religion in its etymological origins means to bind together again. Relegare, to bind together again.